So this is Chulla Sunyata Sutta, Majjhima Nikaya 121. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Savatthi, at the place of Megara's mother. Then, in the evening, having emerged from seclusion, the Venerable Ananda approached the Blessed One. Having approached the Blessed One, having paid respects, he sat down to one side. Sitting down at one side, the Venerable Ananda said to this Blessed One, there was this one occasion when Blessed One was living among the Sakyans, a Sakyan town called Nagaraka. There, Bhante, in the presence of the Blessed One, this was heard by me. Now, Ananda, I often dwell with the place of emptiness. So I'm not sure, Bhante, if this was well heard, well grasped, well attended, well remembered by me. Certainly, Ananda, this was well heard, well grasped, well attended, well remembered by you. Both before and now I often dwell with the place of emptiness. Ananda, just as this place of Megara's mother is empty of elephants, cattle and mares, empty of gold and silver, empty of crowds of women, men, there is this non-emptiness, namely the oneness dependent on the Bhikkhu Sangha. So the point here is the presence of the negative, and by that mean that's basically what emptiness means. Presence of emptiness is presence of certain absences. So in this particular case, the Megara's mother palace is empty. It's absent of elephants, cattle, mares, gold, silver, crowds, women, men. But what is not empty of is the group of the Bhikkhu Sangha. So attending to that which is absent as a uniform basis can be seen as a uniform phenomena, as a single phenomena. That's what it's meant by oneness, basically, one-pointedness. The mind is established upon a single, more general phenomena, in this case the negative phenomena of absence. So the oneness dependent on the Bhikkhu Sangha. In just this way, Ananda, Bhikkhu not attending to the perception of village, not attending to the perception of people, attends to the oneness dependent on the perception of the forest. So a bhikkhu can surmount the perception of the village, perception of people, by having his mind established on the perception of the forest, which means even when he is not in the forest, he could maintain that perception. So although that perception will be absent when he is among people or in the village, his mind still remains established upon that oneness. And that's what it says here. His mind jumps onto, it is clear about, remains with, inclines towards the perception of the forest. So it's not some sort of like a mystical nimitta or whatever you want to call it, upon which his perception is established. It's actually the clarity of the peripheral awareness of his experience while he was in the forest still remains present, because his mind is established upon it even when he comes out of the forest. So he uses the perceptions of the forest. He uses the perceptions of the forest to maintain his mind established upon that oneness even when he leaves the forest. So he understands thus, whatever anxiety there might be dependent on the perception of the village, those are not present here, because his mind refuses to descend from the more general perception of the mood of the forest that he dwells in, refuses to descend onto the perceptions of the village. So he never gets pulled by them, which means any anxiety that can arise on account of the perceptions in the village does not bother him. Whatever anxiety they might be dependent on the perception of people. Those anxieties are not present here. There is only this much anxiety, this much disturbance, namely based upon the oneness dependent on the perception of the forest. So if something were to happen to that forest, he is still liable to a certain amount of disturbance, some certain amount of discomfort arising on account of it, because that's where his mind is established. He understands, having arrived at this perception, it is empty of the perception of the village. Having arrived at this perception, it is empty of the perception of people. There is only this non-emptiness, the oneness dependent on the perception of the forest. That is not empty. But he dwells empty of perceptions of people in the village. So it can be seen here, it's not some sort of mystical emptiness, mystical reality behind the appearances. It's a presence of absence. In this case, absence of unwholesome environment, or environment that's less conducive for practice. Absence of people, absence of the village. So even when the monk goes for Pinnapat, goes back into the village, his mind can still remain established upon the absence of the village, as in he's still rooted in his presence in the forest. And that's what it says here. He says he has understood the emptiness of the perception of the village and the emptiness of the perception of the people, and the non-emptiness that is present is the oneness that's dependent upon the perceptions of the forest. Thus, on account of whatever it's not there, the absence I've been talking about, he sees it as it empty. And whatever remains, he understands it as this is present. So even when he's in the village, the perceptions of the forest are present for him, because that's where his mind is established. So the particular perceptions of the village that he has, they do not reach, they do not change the background of his mood, of that peripheral mindfulness and awareness, which is still rooted in the perceptions of the forest. And that's how he's not disturbed by anything that he sees in the village or hears in the village. And then it says, and in this way, Ananda, there is this authentic, undistorted, clear entry into the emptiness. Furthermore, Ananda, a bhikkhu not attending to the perception of the village, not attending to the perception of people, not attending to the perception of the forest, attends to the oneness dependent on the perception of the earth. So he goes even higher. After his mind has been established upon the perception of the forest, he realizes that he can still be disturbed on the account of that. He realizes that he can still be disturbed on account of it. So then he goes further. But in this case, he doesn't actually go anywhere. He discerns what is even more general in the perception of the village, in the perception of the people, in the perception of the forest. It's the perception of the solidity of the phenomena, the aspect, the element of earth, which means it's the most general presence of phenomena, which doesn't really require you to be in any particular place, but simply to discern the aspect of solidity, the aspect of resistance of things that appear through your senses. And the reason why this is why the mind can get established upon this is because anything solid in the world, anything, any environment that you live in, already partakes in the environment of earth as a whole. The forest, the mountain, the island, the continent, earth as a whole, the element of earth is there, present all the way down into the most particular aspects of some particular village of such and such name with such and such people. So his mind then clarifies and discerns that phenomenon of earth that is contained in all the more particular perceptions of the forest, of the village, of the people. So his mind jumps onto, is clear about, remains with, inclines towards the perception of earth. Ananda, just as a bull hide well stretched by 100 stakes is free from folds, In just this way, Ananda, a bhikkhu, not attending to all these up and down slopes in the earth, rivers and creek, stumps, thorns and sticks, uneven mountain rock, attends to the oneness dependent on the perception of earth. So through the element of earth, he discerns the actual earth. And that earth is equally present in anything else that appears on that earth. So he's not bothered by any mountains, forests, different environments, jumps and creeks. Everything is stretched and even in terms of its presence, in terms of his mind being established upon the oneness dependent upon the perception of earth. He understands thus, whatever anxiety there might be dependent on the perception of people, those are not present here. Whatever anxiety there might be dependent on the perception of forest, those are not present here. There is only this much anxiety, namely the oneness dependent on the perception of earth. He understands, having arrived at this perception, it is empty of the perception of people. Having arrived at this perception, it is empty of the perception of the forest. There is only this non-emptiness, namely the oneness dependent on the perception of earth. So by establishing his mind upon the most general perception of earth as a whole, he is thus empty of all the other perceptions. Thus, on account of whatever it's not there, he sees it as empty. And whatever remains, he understands it as this is present. And in this way, Ananda, there is this authentic, undistorted, clear entry into emptiness. So then it goes further, following the same principle, going for the next, even higher establishment of mind, which is still based upon the perception on the level of the peripheral mindfulness, and that is the perception of the domain of the infinite space. Again, even the element of earth, even the solidity aspect of things that appear, already requires a negative phenomenon of space. Space is discerned through that appearance, which means space is always there whenever there is appearance. Shh, quiet boy. Space is always there whenever there is appearance, which means that space can also be discerned as that which is in common to absolutely everything that has a nature to appear. And that's why it's called the infinite space. So his mind develops clarity about, inclines towards that perception of the domain of the infinite space. It actually properly discerns it within things that are present. He understands thus, whatever anxiety there might be dependent on the perception of the forest, dependent on the perception of earth, those are not present here. There is only this much anxiety, the oneness dependent on the perception of the domain of infinite space. And then he understands that having arrived at this perception, it is empty of the perception of forest, arrived at this perception, empty of the perception of earth. There is the non-emptiness, the perception of the domain of the infinite space. Then he goes further, not attending to the perception of earth, not attending to the perception of the domain of infinite space. He then attends to even greater general phenomenon, even more peripheral, even more subtle, even more fundamental, and that is simply consciousness. As we mentioned in other talks, consciousness means presence of phenomena, presence of things. The aspect of presence is what consciousness is. Usually people think consciousness is in them, and because of that they think things appear for them, but that's not the case. Consciousness is out there with the phenomena, peripherally. You can't attend the consciousness, but you can learn how to non-directly attend the peripheral nature of whatever is present. And by doing so, that's how you develop emptiness of what's in front of you, as we just read through this sutta. So by not attending to the perception of the forest that the monk is in, by not attending to the perception of the earth that the forest is in, that the monk is in, by not attending to the perception of the infinite space that the earth is in, that the forest is in, that the monk is in, he attends to the perception of the just plain, simple presence. It doesn't matter what is present, how big it is, big or small, far or near, presence is there. That's all that he discerns peripherally. That's all that he becomes clear about and his mind gets established upon. And that's what means the infinity of consciousness, the infinite consciousness, as in the presence, discerning its nature, not bound to any particular manifestation of it. Again, it's not a mystification, it's just a simple structural discernment in regard to things that are present. So by emptying himself of the perceptions of himself, of the perceptions of the Bhikkhu Sangha, of the perceptions of the forest, of the perceptions of the earth, of the perceptions of the infinite space, yes, he then arrives at the perception of the infinite consciousness. He understands whatever disturbance there might be dependent on perception of earth, perception of infinite space, it's not present here. Only the disturbance dependent on the perception of consciousness. Then he goes even further, surmounting infinite space, surmounting the infinite consciousness, attends the perception of the nothingness. And nothingness is the negative in regard to that very, very general and subtle consciousness. So once the perceptions of forest, the perceptions of oneself, the perceptions of the forest, the perceptions of earth, the perceptions of infinite space, the perceptions of infinite consciousness, the negative to that is nothing. As I said, consciousness is there with the appearance, which means whenever there is appearance, there is presence of that which has appeared, which is what appearance is, which means there is consciousness. The infinity of the consciousness is the nature of that appearance, the nature of the presence of the appearance. Which means whenever there is something, that something can also be nothing, as in the possibility of it to cease, to not be. And that's what the mind discerns then, the nothingness. The absence of this current presence. As we said when we open up in reading the sutta about the village, the empty of certain things. So it's the negative. So in this case, the most subtle infinity of consciousness that's seen as a general peripheral phenomena, even that can be surmounted, because even that is something. Although it's very subtle, it's still something. And when there is something, its possibility is to be nothing, as in to cease, to disappear. So although there is the present consciousness, the more greater perception in terms of the peripheral development is the perception of nothing, nothingness. So then he understands that there is only anxiety left dependent upon the perception of the domain of nothingness. Then he goes even further, not attending to perception of the infinite consciousness, perception of the domain of nothingness. He attends to the perception of the domain of the neither perception nor perception. So even that domain of nothingness is a negative in regard to something, which is in that case the domain of the infinite consciousness. And so even that domain of nothingness, as peripheral as it is, as negative as it is, as subtle as it is, it's still perceived to an extent. And now that's what the monk realizes. He realizes that even such a subtle thing, it's still perceived. So in order to go even higher, even more generally, even more peripherally, he now needs to surmount the perception. It's not anymore about what's being perceived. Now he's going beyond the fact that there is a perception of any kind, of presences or absences, doesn't matter, perception is there, and that's what he's surmounting in his next effort. So he develops clarity, he develops understanding, he develops oneness dependent upon the perception of the domain of the neither perception or no perception. So he starts surmounting his own perception. And that's why even this sutta says that he develops clarity about it, which means it's not some sort of mystical step-by-step entering to some transcendental states. It's understanding of the fundamental nature, structural nature of presence, of things, of phenomena. So this is the one-by-one order of that understanding, because the structure is ordered. There is a particular thing, then there is more general, up to the point of surmounting the consciousness, surmounting the nothingness, surmounting the neither perception nor perception. So whenever the Buddha spoke about this in the past, about the various samanas and brahmanas that developed this, it's not that they had some mystical experience that they would amount to this. No, they actually developed the understanding of the phenomena. That's why when the Buddha became an arahant, when he became enlightened, when he was encouraged by the Brahma to go and teach, when he begged him to do so because people might benefit from it, the first person he wanted to go back and teach was his previous teacher, who was teaching the basis of neither perception nor perception. And the Buddha wasn't doing that out of some sort of gratitude. He was doing because that person would have need absolutely minimal amount of instruction. Why? Because you could see how far has his mind been developed beforehand. He has developed the understanding of the phenomena, surpassing the consciousness, the infinite space, surpassing the nature of perception, which means he had very, very little dust in his eyes, as the Buddha said. And that's why I wanted to go and teach him. But as it turns out, he died beforehand, and you could understand then why it was such a... The Buddha said, oh, it's his great loss. Because he would have understood Dhamma in a finger snap, because he already done all the work. So once the mind gets established upon the domain of neither perception or no perception, then the monk will understand that there is only that level of disturbance left, which means it is virtually almost nothing. But there is still more to go. Following that structural development of the peripheral domain, bhikkhu not attending to the perception domain of nothingness, not attending to the perception domain of neither perception nor perception, attends to the oneness dependent on the signless composure of the mind. So that's where even perceiving the neither perception or no perception has ceased. So it's really, well, there is no room for movement there, for the movement of the mind, for the movement of the perception. His mind jumps onto, it is clear about, remains with, inclines towards the signless composure of the mind. And he understands that there is only disturbance left to that extent. Once he fully furthermore, Ananda, bhikkhu not attending to the perception of the domain of nothingness, not attending to the perception of the domain of neither perception nor perception, attends to the oneness dependent on the signless composure of the mind. His mind jumps onto, it's clear about, remains with, inclines towards the signless composure of the mind. And then he understands thus. This signless composure of the mind is determined. It is intended. He understands whatever is determined, it is impermanent and subject to cessation. Which means that this monk was already at least a Sotapanna, because understanding that sankharas are impermanent, it's pretty much the insight of an Arya Savaka. So in order to... Of course, that doesn't mean that the mind cannot be developed by someone who is not an Arya Savaka, but surmounting neither perception nor perception, that is reserved only for an Arya Savaka, only for somebody with a right view, because as it became obvious, there is no perception there in a sense of the mind has been unified, surmounting the nature of perception, but the understanding of that place the understanding of that establishment can take place reflexively, whereby when the mind has developed that clarity, the monk will realize, well, as clear as this is, as subtle as this is, it is still determined. It's determined by the perception, by the domain of perception, which in itself is determined by the domain of infinite consciousness, which in itself is determined by the domain of the infinite space, which in itself is determined by the domain of the earth, which in itself is determined by the domain of any further particular perception, such as perception of the forest, perception of the village, and so on. So he understands whatever is determined, as such it is impermanent. So he penetrates that state with wisdom. And that's how there is absolutely no room in that structure of the arisen phenomena, arisen experience as a whole. There is absolutely no room that hasn't been pervaded with that understanding, because he surmounted everything, and then what's left surmounted even that through his own understanding. So there's absolutely nothing left. And it says, knowing this, seeing this, for him the mind is liberated from the taint of sensuality, from the taint of being, from the taint of ignorance. There's absolutely nowhere for those things to remain hidden under things that haven't been upturned. When it is liberated, there is knowledge, it is liberated. Birth is destroyed, holy life has been lived, what should be done has been done. So again, I don't think it hurts to repeat this. These are not some transcendental meditative experiences. They're meditative in a sense of they're reflexive. The mind develops clarity in regard to the nature of the present perception. And you could see that even the very beginning, it was about the negative. When the Buddha was in Migara's mother's palace, he wasn't saying, look at this palace, look at the floor, look at the post. No, he was talking about things that are not there. So from there you go higher. Then you realize, okay, there are things that are there, that's what the mind is established upon. But then you go further. So what else is there? Well, that place is in the forest. So the mind can then be established upon the forest, even without you having to go and stare at the trees and mossy rocks and so on. Then what else is there based on things that are not there? So the understanding of the peripheral, and that's the definition of proper mindfulness, whereby what you are attending, you discern the peripheral in regard to it. And the ultimate peripheral is the presence of the phenomena, the infinite consciousness. Then even the greater peripheral than that, it would be even that place of neither perception or no perception. But that's now you bringing it back onto yourself, so to develop the full understanding. And then when even that perception ceases in the signless establishment of the mind, no more signs means no more peripheral, means you have reached the ultimate peripheral, signless, because all the signs are peripherally. That's just how the nature of a sign works. So once the mind has reached that complete cessation, as in there is no further to go in that structure, and that's, by the way, the Sutta Majjhima 111, where Sariputta, one by one, when he would think, is there higher? There is. That from one goes to the other one, and he fully penetrates and understands the entire structure of the experience from the inside, of course. You can't step outside of it. And then he understands, okay, this is it, this is the ultimate, there is no higher than this, the signless understanding, the signless establishment of the mind. So, so in this case, the monk has fully understood all the more general phenomena in regard to that which is present in front of him, and because of that, he realizes that whatever taint, whatever anxiety, whatever disturbance based on taint of sensuality, taint of being, taint of ignorance, cannot arise for him because he's free from those taints. And then he realizes that only disturbance based upon the sixth domain, dependent upon this very body, with life as condition, that's any disturbance he still has left. And that's the disturbance for an arahant. For as long as his body is still alive, that body can be disturbed. But none of that can cause suffering or bother him anymore. So all the symptoms of avijja have ceased. He understands, having arrived at this perception, it is empty of the taint of being, empty of taint of sensuality, taint of being, and taint of ignorance. He understands there is only this non-emptiness, namely the six domains dependent on this very body with life as condition. Thus, on account of whatever is not there, he sees it as it is empty. And whatever remains, he understands it, this is present. And in this way, Ananda, there is this authentic, undistorted, clear entry into the emptiness which is the best with nothing higher. Ananda, whatever ascetics and Brahmins in the past entered upon and dwelled in the clear emptiness which is the best with nothing higher, all of them entered upon and dwell in this very clear emptiness which is the best with nothing higher. As that's what I mean, it's structural. It means the human experience, the experience of the five aggregates for that matter, has certain order, and this is the order that the one with understanding develops and understands. So that's why the Buddha says, whoever has done this in the past, eons ago, and whoever will do it in the future will do it in this manner. It's the structure, it's not a matter of choice. With nothing higher, all of them enter upon and dwell in this very clear emptiness which is the best. And Ananda, whatever ascetics and Brahmins in the future will enter upon and dwell in the clear emptiness which is the best, all of them will enter upon in this very clear emptiness. And same goes for the ones that do it right now. Therefore, Ananda, you should train yourself thus. I will enter upon and dwell in the clear emptiness which is the best with nothing higher. This is what the Blessed One said. Please, the Venerable Ananda delighted in the words of the Blessed One. So in terms of practical development of what's been discussed in this sutta, physical seclusion is necessary, obviously. Absence of other people, absence of the perceptions of the village. So ideally, places like forests, mountains, where you would be actually physically removed from other people, and then you don't, as I said during the reading, you don't have to go around looking at things and telling yourself you're in the forest, because you are in the forest. So peripherally, you will be discerning things that are absent. Until then, the mind settles in the perceptions of the forest, the mood of the experience of the forest. And the only way to develop a mood of the experience of the forest is to go and be in the forest, or be alone. But there has to be some distance between you and other people, at least temporarily, for the duration of that practice. So the perceptions of the forest are in the background. The tree in front of you, the big rock in front of you, the cave next to you, those things are not the forest. They're in the forest, and you're there with them. So you are in the forest. So you, as I said, you don't need to keep reminding yourself and looking at various objects in front of you and touching, moving, looking, touching, whatever. They're there, and you are in that forest together with them. So you discern the presence of the forest peripherally, being properly mindful of it. You discern it as something that you partake in. You are now in that forest, you are partaking in that more general perception, and that's how the mind gets established upon that. And you would see the difference. Just spend 2 or 3 days secluded from people, going back among people, going back into the village or a town. You will see the difference. You will see how different it is, how different the situation becomes. But the point here is to maintain your establishment of your mind through that clarity of discernment. Maintain it upon the forest. In other words, say you have to go to the town or the village, and but you, even when you are in the middle of the town square, you still see yourself as belonging to the forest, as belonging to the greater perception than all these things that are around you that are obviously more inferior to it. Villages are inferior to the forests. Inhabited areas are inferior to the non-inhabited areas. So you see yourself partaking in, being part of the greater forest. And for as long as you maintain that mood peripherally, you're mindful of it, you allow it to endure, you can spend long time among people and in the towns and villages and still partake to the forest. But of course, if you see yourself as partaking to the forest, you wouldn't want to be lingering around the inhabited areas unless you have to. So you would go when you have to, do things that you have to, but then go back to that which is greater, the perception of the forest that is empty of those things. So even when you would be among those things, you're dwelling in the emptiness of those things because the mind is established upon a more general mood. And then same, when you get used to dwelling in the forest, when you see yourself partaking in the forest, being part of the forest, go even higher. Start discerning the presence of the phenomenon of earth peripherally, within which the forest is, within which you are. So now, wherever you are, whether it's a forest, town, mountain, island, doesn't matter, you are within the perception of the earth. So you could see, say the perception of the forest upon which your mood depends, upon which your situation has been developed. Say there's a massive flood, earthquake, fire, everything gets destroyed. That's what it means, disturbance upon the perception of the forest can still arise. But unless something destroys the entire planet Earth, the mind that's established upon the general perception of the earth cannot be disturbed then by anything. And that's the similar to the practice of earth kasina, where the mind gets established upon it, and then the Buddha said, everything inferior to it will not bother you. But the only way to establish this is to start discerning it on the level of that which is present. And that's what the sutta we just read said. So that he understands this is what's present. This is present in front of me. So the peripheral mindfulness of the mood in the forest is what's present. It's what's my situation. Then the peripheral, the mind established upon the peripheral discernment of the domain of the perception of the earth is what my situation is in. And then you can go further to the infinite space, the infinite consciousness, and so on. But even just the perception of the earth is more than enough in terms of its generality, in terms of its structural capacity to allow the understanding and the cessation of any agreed aversion, delusion, lust towards things that are inferior to it. But one needs to start dwelling in it. It's not a theory, it's not an abstract thought. You need to see yourself partaking. You need to see yourself in your being as something that partakes to that level of that general perception. That's why he's clear about, he's established on it, he remains in it, he dwells in it. So that takes repetitive effort, and obviously it requires seclusion. That's why the Buddha could not have sort of encouraged too much monks and those interested in practice to go and develop dwell in physical seclusion, because it all comes from it. And there is that another sutta similar on emptiness, where the monk goes into the empty forest, root of a tree, empty cave, empty dwelling, and says, this place is empty of others. And that's his starting point, again, to go back into discerning one by one this structure of the arisen situation, of that which is present, which is just another way of saying the establishment of the mind. And jhanas work in the same way, just they're more specific in terms of the domain of sensuality being surmounted and so on, and maybe we can talk about it on a different occasion. But in this case, physical seclusion, dwelling in that which is superior to the inhabited life, inhabited areas, crowded areas, that's how these perceptions begin to be discerned peripherally, and that's how the mind can get established upon them. So just one more thing to point out, that the more general perception of earth is established upon, or rather through, the perceptions of the mood of the forest, the mood of the situation of being in the forest. Anything that doesn't go in that order, like one after the other, as in the perception of earth after the perception of the mood of the forest, it will be abstract. So if it doesn't follow the right order, it's going to be on the level of abstraction, which means there won't be mindfulness properly established, and mind will not be established upon that one-pointedness of that more general perception. So if a person wants to discern the perceptions of earth, they need to be done within, or on the basis, or through the basis of the mood of being in the forest, the mood of being part of the forest, the mood of being the forest. Within that, then you start refining that very mood, perception of the mood of being in the forest, and that's where the perception of earth is found.